have Dr. Laura McAtackney, who's a historical archaeologist and heritage researcher, currently Associate Professor in Sustainable Heritage Management at Aarhus University, Denmark. She has specialised in studying historical prisons, especially the experiences of political imprisonment in Ireland, and her current research involves using a multi-material approach to exploring female experiences of imprisonment at Kilmainham Gaol during the Irish Civil War. She has previously published an archaeology of the Troubles, the dark heritage of Longkesh Maze Prison, and is today presenting a paper on the potential of including other Irish experiences of empire.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for the organisers. This has been a great conference, and I'm looking forward to catching up on yesterday's as well. I'll try and do this briefly because we have a very short amount of time, and I know we're running over already. So my interest in looking at this is coming from a background of having done history and archaeology, but also heritage. So tying into Dom's point around how the past and the present are always in communication with each other rather than us trying to retrieve some kind of past that existed that's pristine and waiting to be found. And so I find, it's really important to be in the places you're studying and also to look at the material remains, what type of things are there, but also what type of things aren't there, and what kind of narratives are forgotten as well as remembered, and the interplay between those. I've been working on Montserrat since 2010, which is, I'll explain briefly in a minute, but it's a British colony that is still a British overseas territory. And it is known as the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean because it had the white population was primarily Irish, and that was the only island in the Caribbean that happened in. So it was an interesting case study to see how Irish people of different types of social status actually, used and interacted with the island. But a lot of them actually moved to St. Croix, which is a Danish island, and that's really understudied from a perspective of anyone outside Denmark, essentially, because of the Danish language. A lot of people don't engage with that as a place, and they have extensive archives. But also they've got extensive remains, which are not the case in Montserrat for various reasons. And so what I became interested in was not only what do we find from various archives, and again tying into Dara's paper that these are not just the official state papers but different types of archives, but also different types of material remains. So not necessarily the kind of elite attractive objects that might end up in museums, but the old structures and buildings that are still all over the island. So St. Croix has an extensive plantation environment that is still in place, and I became really interested in how do people live with this, how do you live in an island and try to move past colonialism when you're surrounded by colonial remains. And I think that's kind of something I'll probably still be trying to quiz for quite a long time. So I'll not bother kind of going too much into this, but I want to move really beyond looking at the plantocracy. From an archaeological point of view, the main focus in the Caribbean has been studying plantations, and I want to look at what happens after the plantations. The plantations are still there, but the meanings change, the people who use them change, and actually looking at different types of stories to present day of what these sites mean and, who they're meaningful to. And to give you a little bit of geographical context, St. Croix is one of the US Virgin Islands now. So that was, the reason I got this project funded is because I work in Denmark, and Denmark owned the islands till 1917. And then they sold them to the United States, which is still a kind of contentious issue, particularly around, who has the right to sell an island between one kind of colonial context to another. And Montserrat, as I said, is still a colonial island within the British Empire. And I think there's something interesting in terms of how do you decolonise somewhere that's still a colony, essentially. That there's no pretense these are not colonies, they are still colonies. Because the US Virgin Islands are not a state either, they don't have the same rights as other states. So they are essentially colonies, and they know that as such. Montserrat's quite a small island, and the reason I have the picture on the right is also a big important aspect you have to deal with now is that there was a big volcanic eruption in the late 1990s on the island, which destroyed a lot of archives, which historians will be very sad about, but more so really disrupted the island in terms of who lived there, the populations there, and who came back afterwards. And there's an interesting issue around how the island uses things like St. Patrick's Day, which were kind of like invented traditions in the 1970s. To become diasporic connecting points. So I think there's an interesting issue around how meaning changes and used in different ways that we need to engage with rather than just look at how things came about originally, but actually how they continue to evolve. But there is a lot of issues in terms of access to archive sites, and also just memory, because a lot of people left and didn't come back again, and only certain types of people did come back. And of course, the colonial Caribbean was a space of opportunity, uncertainty and exploitation. And it's important to realise, and particularly in terms of my project, that my project's focus is not really on the Irish on St. Croix. They're kind of an interesting angle, I think, but essentially the people who live on St. Croix now, who have the more enduring connections to the island and their heritage, is more important than just tracing kind of colonial white people, essentially. But what I was interested in, how do we also find other stories of Irishness that we often forget about, the Irish who move outside of the British Empire. So I wanted to look at the ability and willingness of people to move around the islands, which is often, I think, determined by a lot of different factors, which included the local and the European political context and how they had different roles in the Caribbean. Marriage alliances, economic opportunities and devastation, which often we forget about, is the impact of natural disaster in places like this, including hurricanes, earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Orla Power has done a lot of work looking at the connections between Montserrat and St. Croix through the people like the Tuat family, who were well known for exploiting opportunities to move between these two islands, particularly from the 1740s, whenever they moved to St. Croix after the Danish had taken it over in the 1730s from the French. And this included, benefiting from and enjoying patronage, but there seemed to be also a lot of other push and pull factors which don't often get discussed. One interesting one, because there's such a focus on this being a Danish legacy, is actually there was a lack of expertise in the Danish colony of how to actually run a colony. And so it was a lot of the Irish planters were the people who actually did a lot of that, creating plantations on a British model of plantations rather than a Danish model, because they actually didn't have a model. The elevation of Tuat's position through marriage. So once they married within the kind of plantocracy on Antigua, then that gave them enough status to move to St. Croix. And they also had opportunities to practice Catholicism, which was very uncertain in places like Montserrat, because at times it was ignored, at times it wasn't ignored, and the fluctuations were dangerous. So it meant that Irish Catholics could move amongst the hierarchies of those islands, but not always, and it wasn't guaranteed. So to go somewhere like the Danish West Indies, they were much more open to multiple religions. There was 4 established religions on that island, including the Moravians and the Catholics. They only said they didn't want the Jesuits. They were the only people who weren't allowed on the island, which I thought was kind of interesting. Yes, no problems. You can have a Catholic church, no Jesuits. So there was a number of reasons, I think, why people moved, and it was trying to navigate those uncertainties, but also because of the plantations on St. Croix in Montserrat being destroyed in a hurricane just before that was another reason why they decided to move. So Montserrat doesn't have a very extensive material culture relating to Irishness from the past because of the volcanic eruptions and because of what we can access, which is only the north of the island, which was the earliest planted areas, but then the bits that were abandoned the earliest. But there is still a lot of old plantation buildings. Like this is from one of the Galway families, is in the top right-hand corner. But they also have this very strong Irish connection of identity. So they have shamrocks everywhere. They use a shamrock for their passport stamp, which is my passport stamp from 2010. Everything, all the signage is covered in shamrocks. Their flag has this white lady who often has red hair with a cross, and that flag was created in the early 20th century. It was interesting looking at the symbols and signs, and they're nearly all 20th century inventions. St. Patrick's Day is like a 1970s invention, which I think also has a kind of interesting post-colonial context of trying to push back against Britishness, but at the same time not being able to leave the British Empire for economic reasons. So adopt St. Patrick's Day as your national holiday, which it is the only country outside Ireland that it is officially their national holiday. St. Croix, and obviously there's the picture of the volcano, so you can see what kind of disruption in quite a small island that we can't really access quite a lot of it now. So there's kind of interesting issues around how you work with that type of heritage now. St. Croix is a much bigger island, but actually in some ways is even more colonised, in terms of materials, because the layout, you can't really see from this, but the layout is still around estates. So the areas are still primarily what the plantation estates were called, and they're still the main configuration of land ownership. This place names are really interesting and show a very kind of multinational context, and that the two main cities are Danish names, such as Christiansted and Fredrikstad, but a lot of the names are Irish, Dutch, German, English. So there's a range of types of names that are there. But the kind of lingua franca was always English on the island. So even though the Danes ruled it, they also had to be very flexible in terms of language. So actually a lot of the Danish archives are in English as well. And it has a really extensive material culture. Like a lot of the buildings are still there. Like they have had issues with hurricanes, but they don't have a volcano. So essentially a lot of the colonial context is absolutely in place in situ. And I found that an interesting, tying into Stoller's ideas of imperial ruins. Just how do you, live in somewhere like this whenever you're surrounded by the kind of remnants of colonialism, but effectively you're also in the everyday of colonialism, because now it's an American colony rather than a Danish colony. But again, they still have a connection to a kind of residual Irishness, and the St. Patrick's Day is quite a big thing there as well. When I asked one of I met one of the volunteers at one of the museums, who was from St. Patrick's Church in Fredrikstad. He was a Catholic. And he told me that the St. Patrick's Day only really existed there from the 80s, and that started with St. Patrick's Church. It was exactly the same in Montserrat. It started from St. Patrick's Church as well, in the bottom of that island. So I found there's very interesting links about when these things started happening that I'm going to look forward to teasing out. So the issues in exploring Irish experiences, as I say, both of the islands are still colonial. There's issues of records. St. Croix has a much more extensive records, but they're primarily, but not completely, written in Danish. And so there's an out of sight, out of mindness to it. We don't need to work with that stuff. It's too hard to access, so we'll just leave it. There's the issues of material remains. So conducting historical research in the Caribbean has all these issues of survival because of natural disasters, especially hurricanes and volcanic eruptions, also earthquakes. But on a more mundane level, the impacts of climate means that historical documents just disappear really quickly, so things can just be completely eaten up by insects and destroyed by the humidity. And there's also the impacts of colonialism on survival. I think it's interesting, again, with Dara's talk, that these things go to lots of different places because of colonial interests, essentially. Like a lot of the papers are tied to religious archives from those 4 different organisations that were there. So I had to go to Pennsylvania to look at the Moravian archives, which were moved in the 1960s from the island. But also a lot of universities, American universities, are given a lot of documents by people and a lot of historical books. So Yale has some, and actually some are in the process of being moved off island for that same reason. A lot of the archaeological research has the same problems, that it gets, the archaeologists come from off island, do work, take it away to study it, never comes back again. So a lot of collections even now, there's a lot of digging going on, but there's nowhere to put the stuff. There's no National Museum on St. Croix. There's a National Museum on Montserrat that hasn't been open in 10 years. So I think there's ethical issues about doing excavation on islands like that when you don't have anywhere to put the stuff after you're finished. And there's also these issues of funding, which I think also tie into being colonial places, that the governments do not want to put that much money into heritage. So Montserrat had a national museum that was created and closed within 1 year because it was not fit for purpose. It was not fit for a tropical climate, essentially. And St. Croix doesn't have a national museum. It has 2 or 3 private museums, and one of which is semi-funded by the state. But there's huge issues around having national collections in private museums that are not guaranteed to continue to exist. So moving beyond the plantocracy is what I really wanted to look at, and looking at the Irish in different contexts. So we know quite a lot about the Tuats who came along in the 18th century, but there's always been this focus on the golden age of Caribbean sugar plantations, which were already on the wane by the mid-18th century. Plantations continue to shape the island, but not in the same way, and so I think we need to look at what happens after sugar was king, and particularly in 19th and 20th century Montserrat and St. Croix. The times of emancipation are also about changing legal relationships. So that's whenever we find hospitals disappear and prisons start to appear. Because you have hospitals when you have enslaved people because you want to keep them healthy. When you don't own people, you have prisons to put them in if they do things that you're not allowed to do. So there's an interesting change of structures like that. There's a time of great economic hardship, and that's also because the plantations were not profitable, which is why also emancipation occurred. There's increasing white flight from the islands, but there's also great movement at all levels of society, particularly by the 1920s and 30s. All these islands were hugely depopulated before new people came on for various different reasons. But during that period, the Irish on the island were often low-level managers, overseers, small plantation holders, not anymore focused on sugar plantations. There is still sugar there, but there's a lot of other stuff going on too. And on St Croix, at least, there's a lot of priests. So St Patrick's was set up in the 1840s by Irish priests who were Redemptorists, and there's still this enduring connection. Some of the priests still have Irish connections. And as I say, in more recent years, there's this connection and interest to St Patrick's Day, which I already know about Montserrat, so I'm looking forward to finding out more about St Croix. So I'm going to give just a couple of little examples to finish. Just again, looking at these issues around material remains, Irish connections, which are often quite hidden, and heritage. So Wim Estate is one of the only kind of private museums on the island, and this was gifted in the 1950s from the US Virgin Islands to the government of the US Virgin Islands to the St Croix Landmark Society, which essentially holds a huge archive and held these buildings. It's a kind of attractive plantation house, which is, I think, one of the reasons why they kept it. Originally, it was built by Christopher McAvoy, who is assumed to be Scottish, and they realised actually he was Irish. So it's kind of interesting as well, with the name McAvoy just seemed a bit more Scottish. I think that's the only reason people thought that. But his story is intimately connected because he, was the person who paid for the construction of this site. But his story is missing for it because he was there in the 1740s to the early 19th century, and then it moved a number of times, like nearly every plantation on the island moves a lot in the 19th century because they're not profitable anymore. But they end up being then connected to Danish stories rather than Irish stories, which actually they were originally made by Irish plantation owners. The Louette's Lagrange plantation likewise had very strong connections to Irish plantation owners. This house was actually built by a plantation owner in the mid-19th century, but it was bought by the Louette's family, who are Danish, who's still on the island in the 1890s, and they only want their story told at that site. So it's one of the only private museums, but it's set up completely to tell a story of Danish 1890s onwards, and they won't do anything before the 1890s because that's too messy and you might have to deal with talking about enslaved people. So their story is, a very kind of 20th century Danish story, and there's no connections or interpretation of what was there before. Sion Hill Estate was one of Truett's estates, and now it's a distillery where they make vodka. So, I thought there's kind of a nice connection there. But again, there's no Irish presence. There's an idea this is an Irish place, but people don't know it's connected to, they don't know why. They're just like, oh, this is connected to Irish people, but that's the only thing you get from it. And lastly, St Patrick's and St Anne's both have really interesting connections to Irish people in terms of priests, but also priests connecting to plantation owners. One of the churches on the island is on top of a hill with a windmill, which is now a prayer room, which has stained glass windows in it, which is like a super interesting way of converting a windmill. But that's, again, about Irish patronage, bringing the priests into that site. And I'll not go into this, but St Patrick's Day is really big on both islands and a lot of green. So I'll just finish to say there's a range of material traces and memories of the Irish in the Caribbean, and they are complex, but the memory doesn't cross the Atlantic as well as it should do. There's a number of reasons, including a lack of enduring links to Ireland by those who left and few attempts made to use their wealth to materialise themselves back home. There's added to a lack of access to archives and movable material culture that might inspire more research. But the Irish left their mark on structures, names, DNA, religion, and reinfigurations of memory through commemorative events. So my question is there a role for museums to consider how they can collect these enduring material connections to Ireland that are scattered, but also not easy to put into museums? Thank you.